Mike Tyson unbeatable in the ring? Not for Mitch Blood Green. He survived all 10 rounds with the Knockout King in 1986, but that's not what shocked the boxing world. 2 years later, their rivalry exploded onto the streets of Harlem in a bizarre, unsanctioned rematch after 4 a.m. What really happened that night, and why did it end with Tyson being sued in court? To understand how two fighters ended up there, you have to go back to where it started, the heavyweight war zone of the mid-1980s. By 1986, heavyweight boxing had become a complicated battlefield. The division was full of big names, sharp contrasts in fighting styles, and wild uncertainty about who would rule next. Larry Holmes, the long-standing champion, was fading. Contenders like Pinklon Thomas, Trevor Berbick, Tim Witherspoon, and Bone Crusher Smith all hovered around the top, each holding a belt or a claim at one point. Yet none maintained dominance. It was chaos, a shuffle of power waiting for someone new to take control. That man soon emerged, young, fast, and ferocious. Mike Tyson. At only 19, Tyson fought like an old-school destroyer wrapped in a modern body. He wasn't interested in dragging opponents into late rounds or selling drama. He came to finish things fast. By May 19, 1986, his record stood at a perfect 20 wins, with 19 knockouts. His ring entrances said everything about him. No flashy robes, no theme music, just black trunks and cold intensity. Fans loved it. Promoters loved it. And the media couldn't stop talking about this teenage powerhouse from Catskill, New York, whose power and precision made him look unstoppable. But for all the hype around Tyson's rise, there was still a lingering question. What would happen when he finally faced someone who refused to be intimidated? That someone was Mitch Blood Green. Standing tall with a serious, street-tough demeanor, Green wasn't a flashy name, but his credentials demanded respect. Long before turning professional, he had built a dominant amateur career, winning the New York Golden Gloves tournament 4 times between 1976 and 1979. Few fighters in the 1986 field could say the same. He had fought his way up from the rough neighborhoods of the Bronx, earning his reputation through grit rather than promotional backing. By the time his bout with Tyson was confirmed, Green was ranked number 7 by the WBC, 1 spot higher than Tyson, who was number 8. On paper, it should have been a fair matchup between ranked contenders. In reality, the event was primed to showcase only one fighter: Mike Tyson. The imbalance started long before the opening bell. Tyson was guaranteed $250,000, $250,000 for a man who had yet to fight for a title. Mitch Green, despite being ranked above him, was offered just $30,000, barely 12% of Tyson's purse. The difference wasn't just staggering. It was personal. For a proud fighter who'd earned his stripes the hard way, being paid a fraction of what his younger, more promoted opponent received felt like an insult. Green made no effort to hide his anger, publicly calling out the promoters and questioning how a supposedly fair sport could justify such a gap. To him, this was proof that the fight wasn't about competition. It was about marketing Tyson as the next great heavyweight icon, whatever the cost. Adding fuel to the fire, Green's frustration extended far beyond purse figures. The real tension came from his distrust of Don King and his son Carl King, the powerful duo who controlled a huge portion of boxing's promotional world at the time. Green was locked into a managerial contract with Carl King, a deal he viewed as exploitative and restricting. He suspected that Don King's team had sold him out to boost Tyson's growing legend. In interviews, Green openly suggested that his career was being manipulated, that he was being used to make someone else rich and famous while his own opportunities shrank. As fight week drew closer, things grew even more volatile. Green's camp threatened to pull out of the bout entirely over the pay dispute, calling it disrespectful and accusing the promoters of undercutting him deliberately. Negotiations were tense up until the last minute. Ultimately, Green agreed to move forward, but he wasn't going to do it for free pride alone. He struck a last-second deal. He would take the fight, and accept the low purse only if Carl King released him from his management contract a week later. The decision gave Green his long-desired independence, but it also carried heavy consequences. By severing ties with the King organization, he effectively cut himself off from Don King's vast HBO fight network and its most lucrative events. Freedom came at the price of isolation. When Fight Night arrived on May 20th, 1986, Madison Square Garden buzzed with anticipation. For most of the crowd, it was another chance to see Tyson extend his knockout streak. For Mitch Green, it was a battle for respect, not only against Tyson, but against an entire system he believed had written the script in advance. His body language during the walkout spoke volumes. Tense, focused, but visibly defiant. To him, this wasn't just another paycheck. It was his chance to send a message that even without the backing of boxing's most powerful promoter, he belonged in that ring on merit alone. In Tyson's corner, confidence was unshakable. His trainer, Kevin Rooney, viewed Green as another necessary step toward a title shot, another obstacle to crush quickly and decisively. Tyson was riding a run of 15 straight knockouts, and this was supposed to be number 16. The broadcast team framed Green as a test of durability, not a genuine threat, but inside the ring, that narrative would soon shift. Both fighters carried very different motivations into the bout. Tyson came in embodying the vision of controlled destruction. Cus D'Amato had molded years earlier: peekaboo defense, explosive combinations, and pinpoint aggression. Green entered with a chip on his shoulder, fighting not just to earn a win, but to reclaim his dignity. The atmosphere in the garden was thick with tension, half anticipation, half hostility. And though no one knew it yet, the 10 rounds that followed would set the stage for one of the sport's strangest rivalries. As the bell sounded and they met at center ring, the crowd expected another quick Tyson demolition, but Green had no plans to crumble like the others. Mitch Green managed to last 10 full rounds with Mike Tyson in 1986, remains one of the most unlikely feats of that era. Most fighters who met Tyson during his meteoric rise didn't just lose, they folded early, often within minutes. Tyson's speed, power, and aggression overwhelmed men far more polished than Green. Yet on that night at Madison Square Garden, the Bronx native absorbed everything Tyson threw and refused to go down, becoming only the second opponent to survive until the final bell against the young phenom that year. From the outset, Tyson charged forward with his trademark intensity, head bobbing, slipping inside, firing hooks like a machine built for destruction. He wasn't waiting for chances, he made them. For boxers who tried to meet that storm head-on, mistakes came quickly and painfully. Green had no illusions about trading evenly. Standing 6'5", he adopted a survival-first mindset, using his long reach to jab, clinch, and buy moments of space against the smaller, more explosive Tyson. It didn't win him points, but it kept him off the canvas. Every time Tyson crashed through his guard, Green tightened up, tying him up until the referee broke them apart. Even early in the fight, it was clear Tyson's punches were brutal. His body shots sounded like baseball bats hitting a heavy bag. The crowd winced each time. Yet Green stayed upright. He wasn't quick enough to escape cleanly, but he was durable enough to endure, taking blows that would have finished almost anyone else. The size difference gave him small advantages, longer arms to push off, a frame that could absorb more punishment, but the rest was pure willpower. Tyson dominated every exchange, but he couldn't break Green's stubborn resistance. Then came round 4. When the fight turned from physical to legendary, Tyson charged in, landing a savage combination to the head and body. The final uppercut of the flurry sent Green's mouthpiece flying clear across the ring. The HBO commentators jumped in immediately, pointing out that it wasn't only a mouthpiece. Tyson's punches had knocked out the bridge, holding a couple of Green's teeth. In an instant, Green was bleeding, spitting fragments, and visibly stunned. Yet he didn't step back or signal distress. Covered in sweat and blood, he steadied himself and kept fighting. For the rest of the round, without his mouthpiece, dental bridge, or several teeth. He took more punishing shots but stayed on his feet. It was a moment that, while not pretty, became a defining image of that fight. Tyson in full attack mode, and Green, battered yet unbroken, refusing to quit. By the 5th and 6th rounds, Tyson's expression had changed. He kept pressing, but the certainty that another knockout was inevitable began to fade. Green's defense, clumsy but stubborn, was working enough to frustrate Tyson's rhythm. Every time Tyson tried to unload, Green clinched, leaned his weight on him, or smothered the inside work. It wasn't creative boxing, but it was effective in its own way. Tyson landed far more punches, but Green's sheer endurance turned the match into a grind, testing both men's conditioning in a way Tyson's previous opponents had never forced him to experience. Green's physical resilience was only part of the story. Inside his head, old frustration simmered the purse issue, the bad blood with Don King, the feeling that everything about this fight had been scripted to advertise Tyson's rise at his expense. He'd convinced himself that if he could simply stay standing, it would expose the unfairness of it all. Tyson might walk out with the official win, but to Green, survival would equal vindication. That motivation kept him upright through the later rounds, even as his face swelled and his mouth filled with blood. Round after round, Tyson landed clean shots, but Green kept answering the bell. By the 8th, Tyson's corner began urging him to close it out. He peppered Green with body shots, hoping to sap him completely, yet Green still didn't go down. By the 9th, the crowd, originally waiting for the knockout, began to shift. The cheers turned into applause for Green's toughness. This wasn't the massacre they'd paid to see. It was a rare display of endurance against the most dangerous man in boxing. When the final round began, Green's legs trembled, but he raised his gloves anyway. Tyson fired to the body, to the head, every angle. But the clock ran out before he could make the stoppage. When the bell sounded to end round 10, Tyson's hand was raised in a unanimous decision victory. No surprises there. He'd won every round convincingly. Still, the moment carried a strange energy. Tyson was slightly frustrated, and Green, swollen and missing teeth, looked oddly satisfied. There was pride in having lasted what no one thought he could. He knew the headlines would call it a loss, but inside, he believed he'd exposed something deeper. That the fight, like the sport itself, had been tilted from the start. To Green, surviving Tyson's assault was proof that he hadn't truly been beaten by the better fighter. It was politics, money, and manipulation that had decided the outcome before the bell ever rang. The low purse, the managerial entanglements, the promotional favoritism, all pointed to a system designed to elevate Tyson and bury him. In his mind, Tyson wasn't the enemy, just the instrument. That conviction settled hard after the fight, transforming the bitterness over pay and politics into something more personal. And though the Madison Square Garden lights dimmed and Tyson marched on toward his title shot, Mitch Green walked away with a different kind of fuel, the belief that he'd fought the system itself and lived through it. He didn't see that night as closure. He saw it as proof that the real fight still waited somewhere outside the ropes. In the months after the Tyson fight, Mitch "Blood" Green's bitterness hardened into something more deliberate. The defeat hadn't broken him. It had convinced him that the game was rigged. His anger shifted from disappointment to obsession, fueled by the belief that the forces controlling boxing had robbed him of the career he deserved. The system, he said, was built to protect the moneymakers and silence the troublemakers. And Green had no intention of staying silent. He publicly claimed the scorecards at Madison Square Garden were irrelevant. What mattered was the money and politics behind them. The $30,000 check he received, compared to Tyson's $250,000 payout, was the wound that never healed. To Green, that gap represented everything wrong with how Don King ran the sport. He didn't just see himself as underpaid, he saw himself as betrayed. No matter how much time passed, that number echoed in his head like an insult shouted across the years. Green's mistrust of Don King went back long before Tyson entered the picture. Under King's promotional network and his son Carl's management, fighters often signed contracts that gave the family sweeping control over every career move. The arrangement worked for those who stayed compliant, but Green refused to be one of them. He was outspoken, skeptical, and allergic to submission. King's operation, he believed, thrived on puppets, yes, men, who did what they were told. Green viewed himself as a threat to that order. His constant complaints, his refusal to play along, were both a declaration of independence and the start of his isolation. When the Tyson fight arrived, Green thought he'd found a way out. He only agreed to fight under one condition: that he'd be released from Carl King's management afterward. The deal was granted, but the freedom came with heavy consequences. Without King's influence, Green lost access to the televised cards that kept boxers visible. Almost immediately, he was scratched from a proposed bout against James Bonecrusher Smith, one of Don King's HBO-backed headliners. Green realized too late that his independence was career suicide in a sport run by gatekeepers. Free but frozen out, he became a fighter without a platform. With each passing month, the walls closed in. Big fights stopped coming. The few offers he received were small and scattered. His reputation as a loud, unpredictable troublemaker made promoters wary. Every interview became another showcase for his anger. He accused King of shutting him out intentionally, of deliberately wrecking his career to send a message about what happened to fighters who didn't fall in line. In early 1987, he went beyond words, filing a $10 million lawsuit against Don King. The suit alleged wrongful conduct, deliberate career sabotage, and exploitation through unfair contracts. Green argued that King had blackballed him precisely because he refused to be a puppet. It was a bold move, and one that stamped his name in boxing columns again, but not the way he wanted. To many insiders, he was no longer Mitch "Blood" Green, the contender. He was Mitch "Blood" Green, the restless ex-pro suing the boxing establishment. Still, Green didn't let go. The lawsuit became his public declaration of war against the system. Interviews and press snippets from that time painted the same picture. A man convinced that corruption had stolen his prime. Green pointed to Tyson's rapid ascent TV money, global headlines, constant protection from Don King's promotional muscle, and saw it as proof of everything he'd been saying. Tyson, in Green's mind, was the chosen one of a corrupt empire, the living symbol of the injustice he'd suffered. By 1988, Green's active career was barely alive. He fought rarely, usually against opponents no one had heard of, with paydays that barely covered training expenses. The press described him as unpredictable. Behind the scenes, his managers and trainers struggled to keep him focused. He drifted between gyms, sparred with lesser-known fighters, and repeated the same story to anyone who would listen, that he'd been robbed, and that Tyson's fame was just a product of Don King's manipulation. The frustration consumed him, feeding into a growing fixation on the man whose name still shadowed his own. His bitterness toward Tyson began to eclipse his anger at King. To Green, Tyson had become the face of the very machine that ruined him. Every magazine cover, every TV interview with Tyson standing beside Don King, reignited the old resentment. It wasn't just Tyson's success that bothered him. It was the idea that he, too, could have had that spotlight if he hadn't refused to bend. Tyson was now seen as the unbeatable heavyweight champion of the world, the man the public adored. But in Green's head, he wasn't unbeatable, just insulated, protected. As the months turned into years, Green's thoughts grew darker and more obsessive. He imagined confronting Tyson, not as a fighter seeking another payday, but as a man demanding acknowledgement. To him, a real rematch didn't need judges or HBO cameras. It just needed Tyson face to face. Green often told friends that Tyson still owed him something, not money, but respect. That idea began as talk, then morphed into a plan. If boxing's gatekeepers wouldn't give him another chance in the ring, he'd take his shot outside of it. By the summer of 1988, Green's pride and anger had fully merged into one mission: to approach Tyson directly and settle it man-to-man. He no longer cared about contracts or consequences. Tyson's success had become a constant reminder of what he believed the system had stolen from him. All the legal filings, all the accusations, none of it brought closure. What Green wanted now was personal confrontation, the chance to look the man in the eye and force him to acknowledge what happened. In his mind, that confrontation wasn't about starting trouble. It was about finishing something left unresolved. And soon enough, an opportunity would appear in the early hours of a Harlem morning. Far from the bright lights of Madison Square Garden and the order of sanctioned boxing, the setting would be unplanned, the timing strange, and the outcome unforgettable. In August 1988, the long-simmering feud between Mitch "Blood" Green and Mike Tyson finally erupted in the early hours of a Harlem morning. It happened around 4 a.m., outside Dapper Dan's, the famed boutique on 125th Street that had become a landmark of New York street fashion. Tyson was there on ordinary business, or as ordinary as anything in his life could be at that point, reportedly picking up a custom-made jacket. Inside, the walls gleamed with bold designer patterns and the kind of style that defined Harlem's swagger in the late 80s. Outside, waiting near the curb, was a 6'5" reminder of Tyson's past. Mitch Green had not moved on since their fight 2 years earlier. The anger that had once filled press conferences and legal papers now had a face-to-face target. Whether Green was tipped off that Tyson would be there or simply ran into him has never been confirmed. But witnesses agreed that when he showed up, he was ready for confrontation. Tyson, relaxed and accompanied by a few friends, was finishing his errand when Green stepped into view, still carrying the weight of old disputes and unfinished business. According to Tyson's testimony later on, the scene turned hostile almost immediately. He said Green began shouting about money and fairness, accusing him and Don King of cheating him out of his rightful share. Tyson claimed he tried to leave, wanting no part of an argument on the sidewalk. But Green grabbed him, tearing his shirt. Tyson described how he pulled away and headed toward his car, only for Green to follow and rip his shirt a second time outside the shop. It was that second grab, Tyson told the court later, that brought his temper past the breaking point. In his words, the confrontation was no longer an argument. It became a fight. Green's version was completely different. He insisted he wasn't there to provoke violence, but to demand respect and talk business. Specifically, the rematch he believed Tyson still owed him. He told reporters later that Tyson hit him without warning, a sucker punch that came when he least expected it. Green also rejected rumors that he was under the influence of PCP, which had circulated after the altercation. He said he was completely sober, remembering every detail clearly, and that the only drug in his system that night was frustration. In interviews soon after, he even began referring to Tyson sarcastically as Cotton Mike, a jab at what he saw as the champion's protected image. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but it became one of the most talked-about street fights in boxing history. The surrounding area was dimly lit, the night humid and heavy, and in that charged moment, tempers gave way to fists. By most accounts, Tyson struck first, and once was enough. The blow was so powerful that it left Green's face badly swollen. His left eye nearly shut, and his lips split. One local report later mentioned that the impact bent Green's nose slightly offline, even for someone who had survived 12 rounds in the Garden. This was a different kind of punishment. Bare knuckles, raw speed, no referee to intervene. Green didn't crumble completely. Despite the swelling, he remained upright long enough to shout back, though the confrontation ended almost as suddenly as it began. Tyson, realizing what had just happened and unwilling to cause more trouble, left the scene quickly. Green, bloodied and furious, drew a small crowd as word of the clash spread through the neighborhood. By dawn, the story had moved from whispers on 125th Street to the city's tabloids. The next day, photographs of Green's injuries began circulating: a face, puffy and bruised beyond recognition, eyes narrowed to slits. To anyone flipping through the papers, it looked like he'd gone 12 rounds. Not suffered a single street punch. Tyson shrugged off the incident publicly, describing it as an inconvenience that had spiraled out of control. But Green treated it differently. To him, that night had meaning. It wasn't chaos. It was the proof that Tyson, the system's superstar, couldn't hide from him forever. Dapper Dan's, already a cultural landmark, lent the encounter a strange kind of symbolism. It was a place where sports, music, and fashion collided. Having a heavyweight champion and his old rival brawling outside its doors looked almost like a headline staged for tabloids. For Harlem locals, it became an instant legend, a mix of pride and disbelief that two New York fighters had literally brought their feud to the street outside the most iconic boutique in the neighborhood. The fight's legacy was measured differently for each man. For Tyson, it was an embarrassment, a headline he didn't need in the middle of his dominant run through the heavyweight division. For Green, bloodied but alive, it was another round in his long battle for recognition. He told journalists that the incident wasn't finished business, that Tyson's punch had only made things worse. His public defiance and bruised appearance reignited the media's fascination with their strange rivalry. In the weeks that followed, rumors spun faster than the truth could catch up. Some claimed Green planned revenge. Others said he was preparing another legal move. And behind the scenes, Tyson's team braced for fallout. The fight was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Green's anger hadn't faded. If anything, it had found a new target, not just Tyson's fists, but Tyson's fame and fortune. He was convinced that the world had seen the physical side of their feud, and now it was time to show the financial one. As the bruises healed and the noise faded, the story shifted from Harlem sidewalks to the courtroom. The confrontation outside Dapper Dan's would soon be re-examined in legal language instead of street slang. And for Mitch "Blood" Green, it signaled a new round of battle fought not with punches, but with lawsuits. Once the dust settled from the Harlem street fight, the next round between Mike Tyson and Mitch "Blood" Green played out not with fists, but before a jury. Green filed a civil lawsuit seeking $25 million in damages, claiming the 4 a.m. encounter outside Dapper Dan's had left him with lasting injuries and permanently damaged his ability to earn a living. For Green, this wasn't only about physical pain. It was about payback for what he saw as years of disrespect and exploitation. If the system that backed Tyson wouldn't give him justice in the ring, maybe a courtroom could. From the beginning, the case had all the spectacle of a title fight, minus the gloves. Green came out of the gate, repeating his version of events. He hadn't been looking for trouble that night. He insisted he'd only wanted to talk, to clear the air about old business, and that Tyson had attacked him without provocation. The lawsuit claimed Tyson's punches were excessive, leaving him with facial fractures, serious swelling, and income loss from canceled boxing opportunities. Green's language was direct. He accused Tyson of being reckless, violent, and drunk on fame. He said Tyson had humiliated him publicly and physically, turning Harlem into an unsanctioned arena and him into a victim. Tyson and his team countered with a familiar argument. They insisted Green was the aggressor from the start. Tyson's version of the encounter was that Green approached him, shouting and accusing him of betrayal, then grabbed him and ripped his shirt twice before Tyson threw a single punch in response. His lawyers framed the case as one of self-defense, portraying Green as a frustrated former fighter, desperate to reignite a grudge that had burned out 2 years earlier. The defense leaned on witness statements and Tyson's own calm retelling, painting Green as an instigator who turned a chance meeting into a confrontation. The heart of the proceedings became a matter of intent. Had Tyson simply defended himself, or had fame and power given him license to lash out? Spectators filled the courtroom benches just to watch their dynamic reversed. Green, once a nearly forgotten heavyweight, found his name back in the headlines, while Tyson, still world champion, sat in a defendant's chair. The attorneys on both sides dissected every moment from that Harlem encounter. Green's arrival time, the physical distance between them, and the conditions under which the first blow landed. Cross-examinations stretched for days. Green's lawyers focused heavily on the aftermath. They presented photographs of his battered face, described the deep bruising around his eyes, and cited medical reports listing damage to his nose and orbital bone. They claimed these injuries weren't just cosmetic, they had derailed what remained of Green's boxing career. In their narrative, the street brawl was effectively a career-ending assault. Tyson's legal team responded by emphasizing Green's history of volatility, reminding the jury that he'd previously sued Don King and had a known reputation for erratic behavior. They argued he was using Tyson's name to revive his relevance and extract a payout he hadn't earned in the ring. The tension was thick when closing arguments arrived. Tyson's attorney told the jury that while the encounter was regrettable, it wasn't assault. It was an impulsive act of self-protection. Green's lawyer framed Tyson as a man who thought himself above consequence, someone whose fame insulated him from restraint. Between the two extremes lay the truth. A messy human conflict, born from pride, frustration, and a feud that never seemed to end. When the verdict finally came, it captured that gray area perfectly. The jury agreed with Tyson on one major point. Green had provoked the fight. They believed Tyson's version of events, that Green's grabbing and tearing of his shirt, had escalated the confrontation. In other words, Green had crossed the line first. But that finding didn't absolve Tyson completely. The jury also decided that regardless of provocation, Tyson had used excessive force and was legally responsible for the injuries that followed. It was a split judgment that reflected the complexity of their feud. Mutual fault. Different consequences. Then came the numbers. Green's demand for $25 million had made headlines, but the actual award brought reality back into focus. The jury ordered Tyson to pay $45,000 in damages, a fraction of what Green had asked for. Though more than many expected, for Tyson it was pocket change. For Green, it was vindication of sorts, even if the dollar figure barely covered his legal bills. The ruling acknowledged Tyson's liability, but also reinforced the conclusion that Green had borne responsibility for what unfolded that night. There was a peculiar irony buried in that outcome. One the press didn't miss. The $45,000 Green received in damages exceeded the $30,000 purse he'd earned for going 10 punishing rounds with Tyson in their official 1986 fight. The unauthorized, chaotic street confrontation, the one that left him swollen and publicly embarrassed, ultimately paid better than the legitimate bout that started their rivalry. For a man who'd framed his entire conflict around money, respect, and fairness, that detail carried a sting and a strange, poetic symmetry. The brawl had cost him teeth and dignity, but in a technical sense, it had been his most profitable meeting with Tyson. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw Green's legal persistence as admirable, a man refusing to be dismissed by the sport that had cast him aside. Others viewed the lawsuit as opportunistic, a last-ditch attempt to monetize a feud that had already worn out its relevance. Tyson's boxing career barely blinked under the weight of the settlement. He kept training, kept fighting, and kept drawing headlines. Green, meanwhile, left the courthouse with a check that didn't fix much. For him, the fight had always been about something larger than money. A fight for recognition, for justice, for the simple acknowledgement that he mattered in a world that had used him up. In the years that followed, that unending search for validation would shape the rest of his story. The courtroom defeat didn't quiet his anger. It only deepened it. Where Tyson moved on to new battles in the ring, Green's fight turned inward, against the sport, the industry, and eventually, himself. Green's life after the Tyson courtroom verdict unfolded like a long, uneven descent. The defiance that once made him stand out now isolated him. The same fire that had fueled his resistance to boxing's power brokers burned through what little stability he had left. While Tyson's career continued under the bright lights, Green's drifted toward the fringe. Cut off from promoters and television deals, he became a man fighting to stay visible in a sport that had already moved on. Post-lawsuit, Green's career barely flickered. Promoters didn't trust him. He had a reputation for being unpredictable, outspoken, and unwilling to play along. What had once been seen as bravery now looked like volatility. To matchmakers, he wasn't worth the risk. By the end of the 1980s, Tyson was an international headline. Green was a forgotten name on dusty fight cards. His refusal to conform, the same principle that had once defined him, had closed nearly every door in his path. By the early 1990s, Green was scrambling for relevance anywhere he could find it. One of his last notable appearances came in 1993 against Bruce Johnson in a small, poorly attended club fight, a far cry from Madison Square Garden. What was supposed to be a comeback instead turned into an example of how far he'd fallen. Frustrated about what he considered another disrespectful purse, Green spent the first rounds complaining openly to the referee and refusing to throw punches. He argued repeatedly between rounds, ignoring instructions and shouting at ringside officials. By the third round, the exasperated referee had seen enough and stopped the fight, declaring it over. The scene was awkward, almost surreal. For spectators who remembered Green as the defiant fighter who once stood 10 rounds with Tyson, it was a sad glimpse of a man undone by pride and frustration. The setbacks kept piling on. By the mid-1990s, Green had turned into more of a headline than an active contender. In December 1995, just as he was lined up for a fight with rising star Shannon Briggs, things unraveled again. According to reports, Green got into a heated argument with his manager over money and accusations of broken promises. The confrontation ended violently. Green smashed up the manager's office in anger. He was arrested and charged with criminal mischief, effectively derailing what little momentum he might have regained. The canceled Briggs fight would have been his first significant payday in years. Instead, it became another missed opportunity, overshadowed by his temper and a police report. Outside the ring, his finances were collapsing. The $45,000 from his Tyson lawsuit, the one symbolic win he could claim, didn't last long. With no steady income, mounting legal debts, and few promoters willing to take his calls, Green's life turned into a string of financial disputes and short-term hustles. He sold autographed gloves, made brief television appearances, and claimed to be training new fighters, but nothing truly stuck. By the 2000s, he was part of boxing's folklore rather than its living ranks. A name that surfaced in interviews only when someone mentioned that fateful Harlem street fight. But the troubles went deeper. Green became entangled in several lawsuits, one of the most damaging involving Sire Spirits, a venture tied to counterfeit liquor allegations. The case spiraled into a scandal highlighting fraud claims and misuse of funds. When it reached federal bankruptcy court, the outcome was conclusive. The debt tied to his involvement was ruled non-dischargeable under sections addressing fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. It was a rare, cold verdict that spoke not of clerical mistake or bad luck, but of personal accountability. For a man who had spent his entire career railing against corruption, to end up judged guilty of deceptive conduct himself, gave his legacy a grim symmetry. The rebellious fighter who once called the system crooked had become entangled in the very kind of deceit he'd always condemned. His bankruptcy filings revealed little left to protect scattered assets, unpaid debts, and a fading reputation. Friends who had once trained with him said he carried himself with the same defiance. But there was exhaustion beneath it now. He still blamed promoters, still talked about the Tyson fight as if it had happened last month. But the world had stopped listening. The feud that had defined his life remained his only story, and repeating it was the only way he stayed remembered. Over time, Green's name became less about boxing and more about warning. The loud, confident heavyweight who once stood against the sport's power brokers had turned into a living example of what happens when anger becomes identity. His early pride and independence, admirable traits in the right context, had hardened into bitterness and isolation. By the late 1990s, his career was effectively over, and his life outside the sport was defined by headlines that had nothing to do with fighting. Even so, he never fully disappeared. Green would resurface every few years in interviews, bringing back the same stories about Tyson, the promoters, and the invisible hand of boxing corruption. To fans, it almost seemed like time had frozen him there forever. The man from that 4 a.m. fight in Harlem. What he couldn't find through the system, he continued to demand from memory. Recognition, justice, and the respect he believed he'd been denied. In the end, the narrative of Mitch "Blood" Green became less about who he fought and more about what he symbolized. His story traced a line from rebellion to ruin, showing how a fighter's fight against authority could turn inward until there was no one left to fight but himself. The system he despised moved on without him, indifferent, leaving him stranded in his own defiance. The echoes of that fall linger not just in boxing history, but in every story about pride colliding with power. And as his saga faded from the headlines, what remained was a lingering question about what all those years of resistance had really cost. Green's story stands as a reminder of how far pride and principle can carry a fighter and how much they can cost. He pushed back against promoters, refused to bow to a system he believed was corrupt, and kept fighting for recognition long after the punches stopped landing. But the battles outside the ring drained him more than any opponent ever did. Boxing isn't just about power in the ring, it's about survival beyond it. For all his defiance and conviction, the question remains, was Mitch Green's fight against the system worth the price it demanded of his legacy?